so excited to be here with you today. How about another round of applause for Rachel and Jonah and the NEXUS team? Love you guys. You're amazing. Well, it's such an honor to be with you here today and to have this opportunity to introduce you to two of my favorite people. It is such a great pleasure.
That's just because we're your boss.
No, not at all.
I want to hear what she really said.
No, it is the absolute truth. It really is. It's just a true privilege of mine to be able to work for John and Laura. And so thank you so much, both of you, for coming today. And Rachel said last night at the opening remarks, she said, when you come to NEXUS, I don't want you to go up to someone and say, oh, what do you do? What do you work on? I want you to go up to them and say, what is your passion and how can I help? So, John and Laura, what is your passion?
Do you want to start? Okay. Well, I think in this instance, we share a passion, which is to improve people's lives. So to make people's lives better. We focus on the United States, but clearly that is a passion that transcends national borders. But we created a foundation to try to make people's lives better by implementing solutions that are superior alternatives to the status quo. So in a nutshell, that is what we do.
I think it's such an important question because you can't be successful at anything if you're not passionate about it, right? If you're not giving your all. And in this world of philanthropy, I think a lot of people will end up writing small checks. A lot of people do that. But the people in this room who have made the effort to come out, gather in DC, and really spend time, it's an indication that everybody has passion in this room. And that's what really drives the best results. Philanthropy is hard. That's one of the things we've really learned, that to do it right, to do it well, it's hard. And if you don't have that passion about what you're doing, you're just not going to do it successfully.
So tell us a little bit about your journey, how you got to where you are now, and what you have thought about along the way as you have developed and refined your approach to philanthropy.
We started, we're very fortunate, as many of you, if not all of you in this room, we share a position of having an ability to start thinking about these issues early on in life. Traditionally, historically, philanthropy was something that you did at the end of your life, right? You lived your life and had a prosperous a prosperous life and a prosperous business career, and then at the very, very, very end, almost like on your deathbed, you started thinking about, oh, I can't take it with me, so what am I going to do? Not to be trite about it, but I think that historically and it's also sort of human nature to want to keep things until the very end, right? Because, who knows what could happen? I might need all of this money when I'm 75, 80, or 90, so I'm not going to keep it until then. We were very fortunate to be in the position to face these issues much, much earlier when we were in our 30s. And we really, after we got married and had children, and really started thinking about what we wanted our mark to be in this world, and what we wanted to leave for our children, it became very clear to us that the most important thing that we could do for our children is to leave the country in a better position than how we had found it. So we started this journey of philanthropy in a more formal way. We had, of course, always been interested in philanthropy and charities, and we'd always been very active in trying to contribute to our society. But we really decided to make this our life's work and our long-term projects, starting when we were in our mid-30s. And we started the foundation and started this journey of, as John said, of learning. It's a very, as you all know, philanthropy is a very personal experience. Nobody can tell you what should move you. People can assert views as to how you should go about achieving the change that you want to see, but there are very few wrong answers, I think, in terms of what you should focus on. I think a lot of it has to do with all of it has to do really with your personal passion, your preferences, and and what you value. So for the last, I guess, 12 years, we've been in this journey, learning about ourselves and learning about the areas in which we took an interest, and hopefully trying to get smarter and trying to figure out how we can get to better answers to make our country better. We started in education, which is not uncommon, I think, for many philanthropists. We continue to have a very deep belief that education is a civil rights issue, and that it is imperative upon all of us to ensure that educational opportunity is provided to everybody in this country. So we started that path. We started our philanthropy more formally in that path in education, and that led us to really examine what the root causes are of the systemic problems that lead to educational inequality, which really relate to poverty and social justice. So much of our work then branched out to addressing in various forms issues of poverty, social services, social justice, and policy. And that's what we're about today.
And John, can you talk a little bit about the way you go about analyzing the issues? Because as Laura said, education was an area of interest. Other areas of interest, of course, are criminal justice and healthcare. So how do you take those issues and figure out how you can make a difference in that space?
Well, for me, it melds very well with the previous question about how I got started and how we got started. So I had made my first contribution probably when I was in my mid-20s, and I was working too many hours and making more money than I was expecting, and thought I should have an obligation to give back, and I had no idea what to do. And I remember being in the supermarket, and there was a magazine, maybe a Money magazine or Fortune or something, and the title was Top 200 Nonprofits in America. And I picked it up and threw it into my grocery basket and took it home. And when I looked at it, I looked at education. And it so happened that one of the organizations was KIPP Charter Schools, which got started in Houston. And at that time, I'd never heard of it. But it was in Houston. And so it was very easy for me to go knock on their door and say, what are you doing? And that led to me coming home, writing them a $25,000 check. And one thing led to another, and I joined the board. And then Laura and I met. But that journey from writing the $25,000 check to where we are today was about trying to really dig into the issue of education. So the first thing I saw going into the charter school was this school is getting very different results than the one teaching the same demographic down the street. And so why is that? And what seems like it's an easy question is actually extraordinarily complicated. And it took me years, it took the two of us years to really get at our theory of change as to what the problems were in education and what the solutions were and the solutions at scale. And we arrived at this point that there was a lot of public policy decisions that had been made along the years that were driving some of the outcomes. And if we could concentrate, we had the resources, we had the time to concentrate on looking at the public policy aspect of the problem and trying to address it that way. And once we had that framework, we started seeing other problems in the United States that we could apply that same framework to. So although we were involved in a lot of things from criminal justice to healthcare to public finance, they all have this tie of having this public policy aspect of trying to improve how government interacts and provides services to the people. And we try to identify how did we end up at this equilibrium that we're at today? And what's the flaw in the system as to why people aren't happy with where we are? And it could be asymmetric political power. It could be concentrated benefits, diffuse costs, or just a lack of information by the consumers. It could be politically expedient for the politicians to make a certain decision. There are any number of what we call market failures in the systems that lead to how our public systems are designed. And so we've applied that same framework that we did in education to all these various areas.
So I know there are a number of people here today who are affiliated with foundations, but for those who are not, and they are just interested in perhaps pursuing work to change and improve public policy, but they don't have a staff of 80 people at a foundation. What advice would you have, or not necessarily advice, but what learnings have you found along the way that you think could be helpful now that you're about 12 years in?
Well, I've got two. And coming from the finance world, I always apply the finance metaphors to philanthropy. So one is, I find the allocation of philanthropic capital to be very similar to the allocation of investing capital. And if you talk to venture capitalists, especially out in California, they talk about that they want to bet on people. So if you think about, if you have two options of having a great idea and a mediocre person running it, versus having a mediocre idea and a great person running it, the venture capitalists, at least the successful ones, will always bet on the latter. They want to bet on the great person. Because the idea can change. A great person can change the idea and meld it and make modifications. People don't change. Right? It's very hard to change a person. So we've really, looking back into our successes and our failures, of which we've had a number of both, right? We've had success when we've bet on the person. The second is the specialization, and that's, I think, again, as an investor, you don't want to be investing in one real estate deal and then one energy deal and one tech deal, because the expertise you can provide in any one of those gets to be pretty limited. And I think we each don't need to go save the world individually. There's lots of people in this community of philanthropy. I think the higher value add is choose an area, become a specialist and expert in it, think about what's your theory of change in that area. Get to know all the groups, all the individuals in that area, and concentrate giving in that one area that you have the most passion for, that you have the most knowledge, rather than trying to spread it around to all these different groups. Yeah.
I fully agree with all of that. I do think, though, that what John described takes time. And many of you, many people who are in a position to give a lot of resources don't have that time, because we have day jobs, because we have other commitments, or simply we just don't have the bandwidth. And I think in those cases, I do think that there are some areas in philanthropy that do have mature organizations. And one thing that I've seen, particularly in the younger set of philanthropists, and I'll count us in that set, although we're, I think, aging out of that group, we suffered from this as well. I think when we started, there's this inertia and panic about doing something wrong, and so the uncertainty paralyzes you, or at least it paralyzed us at some level, and you're so afraid of doing anything because you're waiting to become an expert, because you recognize that you don't know enough, or that you don't know as much as you'd like to know, or maybe in your background you went to a great school and you were the star in your class, and so you're used to sort of you want to be that star, and I think that's inspiring and admirable, but I think it can also be paralyzing and frankly destructive in philanthropy. Because philanthropy is not unlike any business endeavor. Sometimes you just have to plunge in and make mistakes and own them and learn from them. But in the interim, if you wait too long, you miss your window. And I've seen that happen, or I have voiced that criticism of others in philanthropy, where I just don't understand why they don't just start moving, right? Why just start doing things, because by doing things, that's how you learn. And and not unlike in the private sector, you need to wear mistakes like a badge of honor, and you need to, as long as you learn from them and don't repeat them.
To that point, since failure can be, or the possibility of failing can be paralyzing, how do you know when you know enough to dive in, and how do you think about risk? When are you ready to go and say, okay, now I know enough, or now I feel like I'm ready to make a move?
Well, I'll take the second part of that question, and I think because we're the principals, we're the funders of our foundation, and we're active, this is our life's work, we're at the office every day, we're willing to take and have that ability to take and own that risk that I think legacy foundations struggle with. So whenever it is a staff-led foundation, it's harder to fail. I think the incentives in the philanthropic world and the foundation world frequently push towards doing risk adverse, the lower risk, lower return type of investments. And there's some good stuff there. But I would argue that in the world of opportunities, that low risk, low return stuff gets overfunded. And the high risk, high return stuff that oftentimes it has a good chance of failing, might have a very high chance of failing, but if you have success in it, it has very high upside, gets underfunded. And I think when we look at this market of philanthropy, one of the advantages we have, and I think that you have, is that you are, by being able to make that decision and having ownership of the money, you can report to yourself rather than having to report to a board, or for those that are in that situation. And that allows you the freedom to take those opportunities in the market of philanthropy.
And I also wouldn't, I would not underestimate the influence that you have over thought leaders. In other words, much of what we do is general interest reading, and that's where we get our ideas. From everything from podcasts to documentaries to books, etc. You should never hesitate to reach out to the author of an article that you found interesting, saying, "Hey, I read your article. I would love to continue the conversation or have you educate me about what might be the implications of this idea that you had." We do that very, very often, and I think that it's one of the greatest things about this job and about this line of work is that you have access to those people, to the leading thinkers who really are the sources of this innovation. And that idea might not be exactly what you're looking for, but you'd be surprised at how often you can iterate that idea into something that might be actually what you're looking for.
So when people are ready to take a risk and pursue their passion, then I think the next question becomes, or a question anyway, is what ultimately do I want to accomplish here? What does success look like? Particularly when, everyone is working on very complex issues like ending poverty and reforming the criminal justice system, fixing our healthcare system. So with issues like that, how do you think about success and what are you striving for?
Yeah, I'll start. I think for us, because we have a focus on policy, we do have a long-term focus. Success is a long-term play. So what would I like to see in 20 years? I'd like to see, among other things, policymakers making decisions based on evidence and not on intuition. I'd like to point to state governments, local governments, even the federal government's ability and practice of evaluating evidence under a rigorous standard and having that evidence translate into resources being allocated to programs that work. That would be a win. I think there's any number. I'd like to see a criminal justice system that does not manifest all of the issues that we see in our existing criminal justice system, ranging from discrimination based on resource level to discrimination based on race to severe injustices from the pretrial phase through the incarceration phase and beyond. I'd like to see a system that embraces, again, evidence-based practices to try to make people's lives better and make communities safer and allow people to prosper. So I think we can point to, in each of our issue areas, specific things, but I think that broadly, for me, and I think that given our policy focus, it's really about changing the culture. And it's really about finding, sort of embracing that theory of change that we should all be looking toward evidence to dictate and demand that governments look toward evidence to dictate how our resources are allocated. Thank you. Leela asked her to do that. Just,
I'll answer the question from a little different framework and more of a theoretical, and go back to a grid I presented at our annual meeting, which was looking at high impact, low impact, high risk, low risk. Right? And so trying to think about, define what success is on any given project up front, and is this a high impact or low impact type of project? Right? And again, low impact stuff is fine, right? But you better have a high probability of success on those. You don't want to be doing the low impact, high risk projects. You stay away from that area. And so defining success and what, if this project is successful, how does that improve the world, and trying to define that up front, I think is very valuable.
So I know that we're making gains in a number of areas. There's a lot to be proud of. But as you look, Laura, as you were saying, 10 or 20 years out, what would you like to say? Because you did have the great fortune of starting this early on in your life. As you get 10, 20, or even further than that out in your life, what would you like to be able to say that you have accomplished in terms of making the world a better place yourself?
I have a very simple answer, and that's exactly what you said, right? Is that we want to be able to say that we improve the world, that whenever we're on our deathbed, we can look back and say, not only did we raise a good family that's healthy and productive and happy, but that we helped others, and that by being alive, we help contribute back to society. And without defining in advance about what specifically we have to do to get there, but the overarching theory of the work is how do we get to that point. So.
And what are you most excited about right now?
we're excited about everything we're doing, Leela. No, we are. I mean, and that sounds trite, but it's absolutely true. We have we are probably to a flaw agnostic and dispassionate, not non-passionate, but dispassionate about what we invest in, and we really we try very hard not to invest with our hearts and to really follow a very strict rubric of analysis to determine where we allocate our resources and where the opportunities are. So every area that we invest in, we find great promise in. Now they're in very different areas of the spectrum and positions on the spectrum in terms of maturity. So there are some, like criminal justice, that have exploded in the last couple of years, where we will likely see dramatic change in this year, next year, and in ensuing years. And then there are others that are more nascent, where we have a belief in the issue, we have a belief in what kinds of interventions would yield better answers, but the horizon is much longer. So it's it's harder to. We're excited about them in concept, but I can't point to a specific thing that you're going to see this year that is going to make a big splash in the way that some others will.
Yeah. Well, and I can certainly say, if you'll allow me, I know you said, I'm here with the people I work for, but it is true that when Laura says we're excited about everything that we work on, Laura and John are at the office every day, taking meetings, taking calls, emailing people, and it's just been, such a great privilege to work for you over the past 5 years. Thank you so much for doing this and being here today and sharing your thoughts, and thank you to everyone from NEXUS.
Thank you.